Mr. Tabish Khair, right? Well, special because Tabish was born in Gaya, India in 1966. He was brought up there in a traditional Indian family. And then he went to university there to start off as a medical student, as pragmatic as most Hong Kong elites, as taught by their parents, right? And then in the middle of his studies, am I right, you deserted medicine like Mr. Lu Xun, our own writer in the 1920s, and then you opt for literature. And then, after a convoluted path, and then you end up in teaching in Copenhagen, and then in the meantime, you've come back to Hong Kong. You've come to Hong Kong and stayed with Baptist universities. In the meantime, you finished off quite a couple of great and interesting works. And now Mr. Khair lives in Copenhagen. We just talked about the horrible tragedy that happened in Norway, right, before you all came in, right? That happened in the same group of countries, where you previously come from. Now, I'm going to have a lot of questions to ask Tabish, because he's an Oriental. He's from India. And his country has got, 6,000 years of glamorous history of civilization. He's a man of everything. He's a man of the East and the West. He's the man of science and arts, right? And so by coming to a seminar, coming to a book talk where Tabish is the talker, is the speaker, I think would benefit most of Hong Kong Chinese audience, including me. So, shall we start off with the most cliche and boring questions? Why you write and how you write?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it working? Okay. Thank you, Chip, and thank you to the Hong Kong Book Fair. This is my third trip to Hong Kong, and every time I like Hong Kong a bit more. I liked it the first time, too, when I came to Baptist University in Hong Kong for a short period, about 3 weeks or so. Then I was back here sometime last year when I was shortlisted for the Man Asian Award, which is awarded from Hong Kong. And now I'm here again for the Hong Kong Book Fair. Now, we'll probably talk more about Hong Kong and other matters as we go on. But to answer the question that Chip asked, why do I write by and large? And that's a question that is very often asked, opposed to me by different people, writers, critics, and in particular students as well as aspiring writers who want to sort of know whether they should go on writing or so on and so forth. And I have an answer that's slightly different, slightly disappointing from certain perspectives. And I usually tell people, especially young people, that you should not write. You should not write unless you feel that you have to write. Don't write because you want to write. Don't write because it's cultured. Don't write because you think you'll make money, because there are many other ways of making money, easier ways of making money. So you should only write if you have to write, if you feel that there's something in you that just has to be put down in writing. Now, of course, that's point number one. But the fact that you feel you have to write doesn't mean that other people have to read you. That's something you learn later on. You learn to communicate your ideas in a way that might be accessible to as many people as possible without you getting lost in the bit to communicate. Because again, you can communicate at different levels. To some extent, you need to have something to say. And the thing that you need to ask yourself as a writer is, can I say this in a way that will be accessible to other people? And to what extent can I make it accessible without actually losing control of what I have to say, without actually ending up saying something that is different from what I set out to say? So there's always a balance there between these two aspects, the fact that you have to communicate to other people and the fact that you still have to be true to use a cliche, true to yourself. So I guess that's the general answer, that I write because I felt that I had to write. I felt I had a story that I had to tell. I felt there were stories that were not being told. I felt that that in some ways I was not necessarily a happier person, but a better person if I kept on reading and writing. And that's also the reason why I left medicine. I come from a family of doctors. My great-grandfather was a doctor. My grandfather was a doctor. My father is a doctor. So given that background, I mean, the only career that was possible for me was medicine. I wasn't even given the chance to think about it. And when I left medicine, my father, who is now very happy with my choice of careers and tells all his friends, no, if your son or your daughter want to do something else, let them do something else. I let my son do something else, and look, now I'm so happy. But he kind of forget that for the next 6 months after I left medicine, he couldn't even talk to me. He was so upset. But the reason I left medicine was simply because I felt that for me, reading and writing and engaging with the world through writing and reading were more important than engaging to the world through medicine, though for some other people that might be the right choice.
Right. Well, you were born in Gaya, India, right, from a country of Hinduism. How much has Indian traditional culture influenced your writing, the writing skill and style and your approach and your views to world and life? Right now, you are a Western writer teaching at a an Indian writer teaching at a very Western university in Copenhagen. How does things matters like cultural clashes, most of which are reflected in your work? One or two I'm going to talk about later, especially this fascinating one, to think about thugs, right? How do you feel as a literary character, living in the West? Do you enjoy it? Or do you think your Orient, how much does your Oriental background shed light in your writing now that appeals to global readers?
I grew up in a very small town, so unlike most other internationally published Indian writers who write in English, I did not grow up in a big city. And most of my education was done from this small town too, so I had finished my master's before I left my hometown for Delhi, where I worked as a journalist for 4 or 5 years, and then I left for the West almost at the age of 30 or so. So in that sense, it's a very different trajectory from other internationally published writers like, say, Vikram Seth or Salman Rushdie or other writers from an Indian background. And in that sense, growing up in a small town probably exposed me to different aspects of India, and that might be one of the reasons why I feel I have to write.
And you're Muslim. You're Muslim.
Well, and I'm from Muslim background, that's true. And as you said, growing up in a predominantly Hindu neighborhood. And again, Gaya, which is, of course, if many of you might know, is better known for Bodh Gaya, which, of course, is known as the place where Gautama attained enlightenment and became the Buddha. So in some ways, Gaya is where Buddhism started from. Gaya is one of the 5 of the holiest of cities for Hindus. So in that sense, even though it's a small town, it's a very rich town with a lot of history, a lot of lost history, one would say. But again, growing up in the professional middle classes, I was sent to a missionary school, English medium missionary school, a small town, but still English medium missionary school, and they have more or less the same standard all over the world. And I grew up being taught 3 languages, a bit of Urdu back home, but mostly Hindi and English, and a bit of Sanskrit in a school, which was taught a bit like Latin is taught in the West. You learn it, but then you kind of forget it very quickly because it's not really used. So mostly Hindi and English. But of course, all the subjects that were taught to me were taught in English. The Hindi was taught to me as a language. English was taught to me as a language. But geography, history, biology, everything else was taught in English. So in some ways, English is my first language, though I cannot claim that English is my mother tongue. I would say my mother tongue is a combination of Hindi, Urdu, and English, but my first language is definitely English. All those aspects come in. But what that means is that when I grew up, especially until I finished high school, my exposure to literature was largely through English. I had read a lot of British literature, and I'd read a lot of European literature in translation. European because, of course, European literature in translation is more easy to find in English, especially Russian literature, for example. I mean, for some reason, my grandfather had a collection of all the great Russian texts in English, and I kind of stole books from his library and read all of them. So it was only in college that I started discovering other Asian, even Indian literatures in translation. Of course, I'd read some of the standard Hindi writers like Premchand in Hindi as part of my Hindi language course, some of the standard Sanskrit writers. But that's a bit like now most of us have read a bit of Shakespeare, a bit of Wordsworth. Wasn't any in-depth engagement. But after I opted out of medicine, I started studying literature. I decided to educate myself, and I went back and read many of these texts, especially Urdu poetry and Hindi fiction, mostly in Hindi and Urdu. Urdu mostly in the Devanagari Hindi script and so on, but that's too complicated to get into. And a lot of it in translation. So in that sense, I think what I'm trying to say is that while I grew up in an atmosphere that was pervaded by other languages and other cultures and was heavily Hinduized, but also with Buddhist and Muslim and Christian influences, because I went to a Roman Catholic school. So, I made a conscious effort to understand some of the other traditions only much later in my life, partly because of my education.
How later? In your teenage, right? What do you don't you recognize about writing? At the later stage of your life, yes, right. Yeah. So I mean, you sound like you come from a similar background as most Hong Kongers come from. I mean, we know a bit of everything. I mean, Cantonese as our native language. We have been listening to Mandarin or a bit of a Shanghainese, but most of our Hong Kong children go to English schools. How come so many Hong Kong parents and students still complain about the poor and the deteriorating quality of the English skills? How was English taught in India?
I think there are certain differences between Chinese regions and India. First of all, I think some of it has to do with the kind of colonization that took place in both these parts of the world. India was colonized in a slightly different way, and quite early in the 18th century, early 19th century, there was this debate between in those days it was the East India Company, but let's say the British in India. And there were a group of British scholars and administrators who did not want to teach Indians in English because they insisted that Indians should be taught in their languages. And then there was a group of British administrators and scholars who wanted to teach Indians in English because of two reasons. First of all, as Macaulay, Governor General, later on said in one of his quite often quoted articles, reports, he says, a single shelf of a European library is worth all the literatures of India and Arabia. Okay, so there was this kind of course, colonial hubris, but there was also a practical reason, two practical reasons. So first of all, administrators were under great pressure by missionaries to work more actively at converting Indians. And they did not really want to do it because most of them just wanted to run the country or make money. They didn't want to start interfering in people's religion and cause trouble, maybe even lose some of the lucrative businesses. So one compromise that they found was actually to teach English literature instead of actively working to promote Christianity, leave that to private missionary bodies and actively work on promoting English literature. Now, anyone who has read Milton and so on and so forth would know that you cannot really study English literature without learning about Christianity. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason was, of course, that they wanted to create a buffer class between the majority of Indians and ruling Europeans, and their English education was very useful. So in that sense, I think the kind of class I come from, we have been taught English for at least anywhere between 4 to 8, 9, 10 generations. And in that sense, I think over the last few centuries and decades, especially after independence, I would say, first of all, of course, we have this long background of having to write in English, but along with that, after independence, we seem to have lost some of our fear of English. In that sense, again, Salman Rushdie, whose literature some people might like or might not like, is important, because with his novel, it becomes obvious. Other people did it too, but with his novels, it became obvious because of their success that Indians were not afraid of English, that they did not necessarily want to speak with an Oxbridge accent or use the kind of vocabulary that would be acceptable. No, I don't. No. My father had more of an English accent than I do.
But your works are extensively read by Oxbridge graduates, right? So that's the difference. Many people here in Hong Kong are obsessed with speaking English with a so-called Oxford accent, whereas at the same time, they can't get even a sentence grammatically right?
Yeah, I think it's always important. Obviously, I try to speak as clearly as I can. But along with that, I think it's something I tell my Danish students, because sometimes they are also obsessed with accents. The English, of course, is only a second language for them. And when they learn English, they want to speak English, what they think is correct English, which is a very clipped version of British English or a certain version of American English. Okay? And I keep on telling them, look, you have to speak as well as possible, as clearly as possible. But why do you want to remove all traces of your own language, Danish, from the language you speak? Why don't you retain the traces that are useful and that do not hamper communication? Because obviously you are Danes and you speak English. That would be the way I would like to hear you. But that's, of course, my position there.
Well, I wish some Hong Kong school teachers were attending the talk today, right? So, I mean, you answered some of the questions I've been bearing in my mind, because I always thought that the way the British colonized India was very much different from what they did to Hong Kong. Well, when they landed in India, they knew straight away that India was a nation with 6,000 years history. They were trying to swallow a huge piece of cake, and you look at the size of the Indian territory, and it's got very rich religious and cultural diversities, Muslims and Urdus, hundreds of dialects. So they had to adopt a very different educational policy, as you say, to convert the Indians, at least the young elite Indian class, culturally rather than religiously. So they left aside Christianity, and I wouldn't say indoctrinate, but allured the Indian elite into appreciating the beauty and the delicacy of English literature, whereas some of the English literature is anti-Christian. Look at Percy Shelley's poetry, Bertrand Russell's essays. It doesn't matter. Right, so this is a very subtle colonial educational policy.
That reminded me. Actually, that was one of the things that happened when the administrators promoted English literature as a bit, or some of them anyway did so, as a bit to promote Christianity. What actually happened was that Indians used the same literature to argue against Christianity as well as their own religions. Because the assumption was that if we introduce them to all these great texts from the West, they will end up criticizing their own superstitions, which some of them did, but they extended the criticism to Christianity too. So in some ways it didn't work.
Whereas when they colonized Hong Kong in the year 1841, since then, the British knew very well Hong Kong's geographical position and its economic and social function. Hong Kong is nothing more than a financial entrepot. It's a place for money making, right? And that's all. So when they colonized Hong Kong, the population was a few thousand of fishermen and peasants, right? And native Cantonese. There was very little sophisticated cultures there, apart from the art of fishery, right? So English education had been designed to, tailor-made for Hong Kong in a way that business English was had more or less been dominating the English English curriculum in Hong Kong, so that we had been taught the kind of business English, counting how much we should get as perks, under the table money, discount and that sort of things, right? The lady down there laughed when she comes from Lantau Island, I'm sure, it strikes a tune of agreement in your mind. So there's nothing to complain. I mean, Hong Kong has been handed back to China, right? For 14 years, not a single Hong Kong SAR education official has ever mentioned what was wrong with our English education curriculum during the colonial years. And just look at the English-speaking countries. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of India and Pakistan-born English writers who write immaculate English, like Salman Rushdie, right, like you, and the Indian written English with an Indian style strikes me with a type of very special flavor, with a finesse, with a refinery that corresponds to hundreds of tastes and flavors of perhaps Indian spices, right? So that is the kind of stuff you don't get from an editorial, say, from the Sun newspaper in the UK, right? And apart from that, not only novelists and poets, right? They are English film directors, right? Film, cinema, one of your interests, right? Like Kapoor, and I remember I was shocked to have watched a film in 1972 called Melody. You remember that? Melody, you were too young, you were born in 1966, right? Melody was a film about teenage, young puppy love, between a primary school boy and a primary school girl. The boy being played by a boy actor called Mark Lester, right? And then the whole film, was accompanied with a few dozens of Bee Gees songs, right? It was set in London, in the dismal and bleak London of the early 1970s, when the economy of Britain had been brought down by the Labour government. It was socialism, trade union strikes, everywhere. It looked absolutely miserable. It echoes the song Streets of London. Yet that film was directed by an Indian director, Muslim director, with the surname Hussain. Right? And 10 years later, another one called The Four Feathers by Kapoor. And then Queen Elizabeth I, right? Elizabeth I with the Australian actress, Kate Blanchett, right? It was directed by an Indian director. Now the English are very arrogant people. They would never let out such a precious piece of cake of creative materials. They would never hand that out to foreigners. Right? The fact that these stuffs were directed by or created by Indian directors tells something. Right? So, do you enjoy English literature? What period do you like the best?
Well, I read very widely. I mean, obviously, I love many English language writers, British, American, Australian, everywhere, African. I think I read quite widely, but by and large, if I have to focus on fiction, I would say that my favorite writers were mostly born between around 1800 to 1950. So I would say that is actually my favorite period. But then I have quite a few other writers who wrote before, as well as quite a few other writers who are still writing today. But by and large, I would say Victorian period to the modernist period would probably be my favorite period.
Well, because teachings, curriculum of Hong Kong, of English literature in Hong Kong during the 70s and 80s was largely dominated by Victorian period.
Same in India too.
Same in India? So I almost thought that there was some kind of cultural conspiracy behind it. They want you to read as much as Jane Austen, the Bronte sister, but they didn't want you to read Lord Byron and Romanticism. Right? This poetry has got something to do with revolutionary value.
In India, the romantics were quite visible, and I think a lot of Indians, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, were heavily influenced by the romantics.
But do you read much of a colonial Indian history? When you were in India, were you taught? You were born long after the independence. I don't know whether your parents told you things like the Amritas uprising, right? In the year, what happened in India in the year of 1859, a kind of couple of massacre that led to Mahatma Gandhi's civil disobedience campaign, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been very interested in history, and obviously, I read history books widely. It's easier for me to remember Indian history simply because it's very much part of my own history. But obviously I've read a bit about Chinese history, a bit about Australian history, and so on and so forth, Danish history. I would probably not be able to recall much of that verbatim or off the cuff. But Indian history continues to focus me, to fascinate me. And part of the reason is that I feel that we are going through an age that seems to be losing its memories. There's too much focus on the surface of everything. And in that sense, what you mentioned about
that's the case in Hong Kong. Is that the case in India?
In India, I think a lot of Indians from my kind of background, as well as quite a few Danes, increasingly from my kind of background, basically the kind of future they envision is closer to what Hong Kong is today. A business society dominated by business. They might not be conscious of it. Some of them are, but they might not be conscious of it. But that's what the focus is on. I mean, even in Danish universities, and Denmark, bear in mind, is a first world country, quite well protected in many ways, culturally, economically. But the focus is on basically cutting down on literature and teaching people standard, communicable English. Okay, and some kind of providing them with a window into other cultures so that they can go there and work, perhaps. Okay, so the focus is not on making people think, making people understand how we have come to the sport that we occupy at the moment, for better and for worse. And in general, there's an attempt to forget about things that have happened. For example, even something people talk about, globalization. Globalization is very big in Europe right now. If you want to apply for funding, you don't have the word globalization in your application. There's no way you're going to get funding. Okay, so you have to put globalization in different ways. But the fact is that when I look at what's called globalization, I can see a lot of things happening. Things are becoming faster, quicker, movements are becoming faster, quicker. But again, many similar things were happening in the past too. One can even argue that in some other ways, perhaps the late 19th century was a more global period, bearing in mind that it was easier for a lot of people to travel around then because passport restrictions or other restrictions were not in place. These days you need to be reasonably affluent or belong to a rich country before you can actually travel to most of the countries. That was not actually in place in the past. It might be that more people are traveling around, but bear in mind that the population of the world has increased by 4 or 5 times since then. So maybe the number of people traveling around has also just increased by 4 or 5 times, or maybe 6 times. So we don't really know. What we have to bear in mind that these things have not just come up recently. They all have a history. They all have a past. And in some ways, fiction needs to be aware of that past. Otherwise, it ends up being too superficial. It ends up being entertainment rather than literature.
Well, yes, when India and Britain meets, the theme of migration or traveling is always involved, right? And also, and here arises the theme of racism, right? Kipling's poetry and the passage to India, right? And also this one, right? The thing about thugs, right? It's horrifying, right? I mean, how come a group of Indian guys, leaving their country and then landing in England, end up things like that, a havoc like that, a few Englishmen, come out and try to examine the size of their skulls, from a purely a very coldly and chillingly anthropological angle, right? Right. I mean, when I read A Passage to India 30 years ago, I was still very young. I couldn't figure out what the novel was talking about, right? It was racism. It was the misunderstandings out of social and cultural encounters between the East and the West, right? Now, is that a theme that's been bothering you, like many Indian writers who write in English? Or for many English writers who write on India?
I think racism as such is something that continues to concern all of us. But more than that, it's because it builds on certain things that are always in place, also in other cultures. Dislike of difference, suspicion of foreigners, a bit to think of one's own culture as superior, and so on and so forth. And obviously in that sense, we are all racist. All cultures have been racist in different ways. You can always think of some group that your particular culture thinks of as inferior because of certain reasons that are similar to the reasons used by racist Europeans to condemn, say, Africans or Indians. Of course, being a scholar, I would not call that racism, because I think racism is an ideology, that divided up races in a pseudo-scientific way. But it is something very close to racism. For example, I feel that Indians can be or have racist prejudices when it comes to Africans, black Africans. And there's no way one can deny it.
When it comes to Chinese as well. Yes.
Exactly.
I mean, our Monkey King used to come from India, from your epic, right?
Yeah, and one can argue that some of these prejudices go back, so that all the Gors who actually have an aboriginal background are depicted as blue, when actually one can argue that they must have been black or dark. And some Indian anthropologists have made that argument. So we have that problem. Now, of course, there's another side, a more deeply philosophical side to it. This is a socio-political, humane aspect. But a philosophical side, which is, how do we actually relate to other people who are different from us? And in some ways, Kipling and Forster, and they're both among my favorite British writers, and the two great British writers who wrote fiction from India. The other great British writer is George Orwell, but he did not write fiction from India. It's the Burmese days and so on and so forth. And they're very different writers. Kipling, for example, is a racist in many of his statements, especially his journalism and some of his jingoistic poetry. But, and I'll come to that part. And Forster tries very hard to oppose these racist prejudices and so on and so forth. But something strange happens in their fiction. Kipling, for example, even in his poetry, the East is east, the West, and
take up the white man's burden.
Exactly. But that poem ends with these lines, but there is something, I'm paraphrasing it. There's neither East nor West when two strong men meet. Okay? Now, you can accuse it of being sexist and all that. But he starts with a statement that we can never meet. He ends with a statement that we can meet. Similarly, in his great novel, Kim, you have all these prejudices against Indians like me, English-speaking Indians. He was more suspicious of Indians like that because we were in between. We complicated matters of identity. So So there's this character called Hari Babu, who is an Indian like me, but he's depicted as a typical Babu, which means English-speaking Indian, unsporty, untrustworthy, obese, comical, so on and so forth. But at the end of it, he saves the entire British Empire through an act of intellectual and physical heroism. So while the novel claims that these people are not to be trusted and are not heroic, it shows these people as extremely reliable and heroic. Okay. Now Forster does something else. Forster, throughout his passage to India, tries to stress what he used to call only connect. The only thing we need to do in literature and as people is connect. But then what happens in the novel towards the end? People cannot connect. The land itself comes up. When Aziz and Fielding are riding together, the land comes up and divides them. So again, in some ways, both these writers, despite their political differences, are dealing with the fact that while there are things that connect us, there are also things that divide us. Difference. And how do we deal with difference? That is something we cannot resolve. Because the argument that the only way to deal with difference is by civilizing people into becoming like us, means that we are not dealing with difference. What we are saying is that we have to erase difference. On the other hand, the argument that we do not have to deal with difference because people are basically like us is also similar. It says that basically there are no differences. So again, we are not dealing with difference. The fact is that there are a lot of similarities, but there are also differences. And we have to deal with both. That's what makes us human. That is the great struggle, the great challenge that all human beings have, all societies have, and will always have, no matter what happens.
Well, I mean, during the time of E.M. Forster and Kipling, there was no such term called multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism once seemed to be the answer, but now the very concept or beliefs seem to be crumbling, right? I mean, you have countries like France or others in Europe trying to legislate laws to ban certain a public exhibition of some Islamic costumes or whatever. You know, what do you approve of that?
It's a very complex question. I'll need 4 or 5 minutes to answer this. So, first of all, multiculturalism, and then the veil and parda and all that. Okay, multiculturalism started off in a number of different ways. To some extent, in Europe, it was a political gambit, and I always had a problem with that kind of multiculturalism because it appeared to be an evasive tactic. There was this assumption that, well, you have your culture, you have your cuisine, we have our cuisine, let's all have a bit of, I'll come and eat a bit of your cuisine, you can come and eat a bit of my cuisine, and we'll all be happy together. But that doesn't work. That's just a political gambit. But of course, there's a deeper kind of multiculturalism, the fact that no culture has been pure. All cultures are intermingled. All cultures have been informed by each other. All cultures affect each other. And that multiculturalism is a part of every culture. It exists inside every so-called pure culture. So, and in that sense, multiculturalism is also valid. So one has to keep those two definitions in mind. And that is again, if one has those two definitions in mind, then one can understand what's happening with, say, the veil or the parda. I will say the parda because that's actually more important because the Islamic overall body coverage. Because there again you have two kinds of reduction taking place on both sides. On the side of Muslims who argue that this is the only way of being Muslim, which is problematic because it never has been, and one can even take up Islamic texts and prove that that kind of that kind of dress is not necessarily something that Muslims have to put on themselves. Now, I'm leaving out the gender aspect, which is something I'll come back to again. So there's a simplification there based on some definition of a pure religion, which again has not existed. There is no pure religion just because religion is also cultural. All cultures are mixed and all religions are mixed and they share a lot of things. Now, on the side of Europe, again, there's this simplification. Oh, Muslims are new. They're going to change our culture, which is, of course, rubbish. You cannot understand the history of Europe without taking into account the Muslim influence. The entire history of Renaissance cannot be understood without taking into account what happened with the Arabs. The Renaissance is not a European thing. It was something that happened across cultures. Again, similarly, when Europeans claim, say, the classical Roman cultures or classical Greece as a European seed, that's rubbish. Classical Greece existed along the Mediterranean. Many of the great Greek scholars were born in Africa or Minor Asia. So these are all simplifications, and in that sense, once one is aware of that, one can avoid simplifications on all sides. Finally, when we come back to the whale, I do think as a man from a Muslim background, I do think that one has to take a stand there. While I think that what is happening in Europe, in European countries, is counterproductive, I also think that Muslim men have to clearly, and many of them do that, also in their daily life, but have to clearly say that no matter what, the demand that women should wear a certain kind of dress is problematic, and that as a man, you are against that demand. That has to be stated, no matter what.
Have you said that on a Danish TV station? Have you said that?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, definitely, yes. Definitely. No, I don't make compromises there. I mean, I do end up getting people mad at me. I mean, when I was in my hometown, I got some local Muslims very mad at me. When I was in Delhi, I got some nationalist Hindus very mad at me. And in Denmark, I got some nationalist Danes very mad at me. And as one of my friends says, it probably shows that I'm not doing too many things too wrong because I managed to get everyone upset sooner or later.
Right. Okay. So, so you're clearly a very cultured global citizen, right? You know, by learning English or trying to write in English, you know, and read more stuffs written in English by all kinds of distinguished writers, you know, I think everyone has got a good chance to make some kind of achievement. The reason why we invite an Indian English writer here is not just examining or studying his works, but we face the current issue of multiculturalism, of cultural assimilation. We, the Chinese, used to assimilate Buddhism, you know, something that came from northern India 2,000 years ago, and Buddhism has been a part of Chinese culture now, you know, in Chinese language terms and vocabularies, you know, that were used to be translation from the Indian language. I mean, that could be done, and that has been done, and there's no reason why, you know, it cannot be done, right? I mean, look at if we go to some Mediterranean European countries like Grenada in southern Spain, you'll be surprised by the Moorish influence of the architecture there, or the temples and the fine carvings, you know, and sculpture, and a bit of everything, right? Whereas it's a pity that Hong Kong has been the place here, the territory has been housing quite a large community of Indian and Pakistani people, and we've been making very little effort to understand them. All we know is that there's a Sikh temple off at Stops Road, and very few people know that the Sikh temples, you know, offers free curry buffet every Friday afternoon. You know, if you dare to walk in, you know, and be a little bit humble and worship their God, you'll be treated with great hospitality, a free meal, right? So this is something new, right? To lots.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Sikh temple, but Sikhism, of course, is very much.
Many people think that the Sikhs are the only Indian people, right, with a turban,
yeah,
you know, on the head.
And
we have a very prejudiced, stereotypical image of Indian people.
Yeah, exactly. And they become very visible because of their turbans, of course. But it's also a religion that's an amalgamation of a number of different trends in medieval India, in particular Hindu and Muslim trends. So Sikhism is a composite religion. It's a religion that grew out of the fact that different religions came together. Later on, of course, it took a number of different political turns, but that's another matter. So in that sense, it's extremely interesting. And again, I mean, what you mentioned about the Chinese-Indian connection. One of the sources of this novel in particular, and actually one of the characters there is her name is spelled in a way that might make you think that it's Chinese. It isn't. That's actually the way that the British sometimes spelled a phrase. But I kept that Chinese spelling for a number of different reasons. I hope they'll become clear. But this came out of a kind of research I did 8 or 9 years back when with some of my friends, European friends, we sat down and we were discussing travel literature. I'm interested in travel literature. And we realized that all anthologies of travel literature are anthologies of European travel writing or Europeanized travel writing. And we said, but haven't Asians and Africans traveled? And between us, we could think of 20 or 25 texts. Then we said, let's do some research. And then we came up with at least 100 different texts. And we compiled some of them, 40 of them. And we decided to start with texts that were more or less travel texts. Of course, one can go back and talk of travel writing and the ancient Indian epics and so on and so forth. And the earliest texts we started with were actually Chinese texts from the 5th, 7th century. Chinese Buddhist monks who came to India and left accounts of their... and similarly, you have all these texts going back to the Victorian period where you have Indian nurses and sailors living in London. And that, of course, those are the characters you find in this novel.
Okay, right. Well, time is... left to the floor, for any questions, related to anything you wish to ask. Yes, the lady there.
Hi, good afternoon, sir. Yes, several years ago, I saw a movie. It's talking about the Indian. The name is maybe Slumdog Millionaire. Yeah, it can got the best picture in Oscar. I liked it very much. It's talking about the poorest people in Indians. So there's a great difference between poor and the rich. So most of people, they couldn't get a fundamental education. So how we can say English? And normally in India, men can dominate the whole society. So how about the women? Can they get the equal opportunity to learn English? So thank you.
It's good you asked me that question because obviously one of the things I engage with very consciously in my literature is the fact that English is still a middle-class language in India, especially English used creatively is, I would say, a kind of upper middle class language in India. Once in a while you might have someone from the middle classes like me breaking through, but by and large, most writers who write in English and who break through internationally don't just come from the Indian middle classes, they come from the Indian upper middle classes and upper classes, to be honest. Which means that it comes with that English, despite everything Indians have done with and to English, comes with certain areas of easy visibility because that language is spoken by certain classes. It also tends to speak about these classes more easily. For example, how do you write about an Indian from a village who does not speak a word of English? And if you write about that kind of Indian, are you really writing about that Indian, or are you making that Indian speak the way you think he or she should be speaking? Okay. Now, this problem can also come up across gender differences. How does a man write about a woman? So it doesn't end anywhere. So this is something that concerns me, and one of the reasons why I write the kind of novels I write. Now, coming back to the specific aspects of your question, if you belong to the middle classes or the upper middle classes, you have the same educational opportunity as a woman as a man would have. Okay, doesn't mean that you're treated equally. By no means. Of course, as a woman, you have to have a career, but you might also be expected to come back home and help with the cooking. As a man, you might be able to go to your college and come back and watch TV, but as a son. But as a daughter, you'll be sent to the same college. You'll be given the same opportunity. There will be the same kinds of expectations, but you'll still be expected to come back home and help your mother in the kitchen. Okay? So there are matters like that. But by and large, if you come from the middle class, you're given the same education. You have the same opportunities by and large. But if you come from other classes, of course, there's a completely different set of standards. But again, bear in mind, it does not mean that you necessarily have fewer opportunities the further down you go. Because when you really come down to the working classes, women work too. Okay? There might be a lot of sexism, but at that level, you have very little education or no education in India. The Indians who speak fluently in English, at the most, that would account for 5 to 10% of India. Now that's 50 million to 100 million people, but still it's 5 to 10% of India. Another 20 to 40% would manage to communicate in English or some other languages and so on and so forth. I've now forgotten the exact data, but I'm very sure that the rate of literacy in India is definitely more than the rate of illiteracy in India is definitely more than 25%. I think it's probably closer to 40%. Okay, so you have that entire class of people, 400 million people who do not really read or write any language, let alone English. So, yeah, I mean, those and again, their Slumdog Millionaire or film like that becomes interesting. And a lot of other writers write about people like that. Sometimes even more in other Indian languages than in English. Because obviously if you write in Telugu or Hindi, you write in a language that is also spoken by very poor people in that part of India. If you write in English, you write in English in a language that is only spoken by middle-class Indians. So obviously there's a slight difference there. And in that sense, I think it's an important matter to be aware of, also because in certain middle-class circles in India, there's a kind of impatience with the poor and the illiterate. There's this feeling, and I can see this in all cultures, so I'm not saying that it's just there in India. There's this feeling, oh, why don't these people just smarten up? Why don't they just do something? No, because middle-class Indians are going through what we love to call shining India. Parts of India are shining. And suddenly we see these blemishes, and we don't like the blemishes. We forget that sometimes, very often I would say, but definitely sometimes, we are ourselves responsible for the blemishes.
Yes.
I'd be very interested to know more about your latest book, The Thing About Thugs. Is it historical fiction? And, what's the motivation and what's it about, please?
I was told by one of my friends some time back when I had a presentation like this one, and this is a friend who had known me for ages, and he attended the presentation because it happened to be in his town, and he said to me, "But why do you have to make your answers so complicated? You probably lose readers because you make your books sound more difficult than they are." So I hope I'm not doing it, but I'll probably end up with a slightly complicated answer. So, in some ways, this is a historical novel. But in some ways it isn't, because I'm very skeptical of the concept of a historical novel. I feel that there's too much pressure on writers like me to communicate a culture or an insight into a culture. And I feel that while I'm willing to do that in my academic writing, in my journalism and all the rest, I'm not willing to be considered a reporter in my creative writing. I insist on being accepted as an artist in my fiction writing and my poetry, which means that while I play with the genre of historical fiction, I also insert things that make visible the fact, at least make it visible to the careful reader, that this is a work of art, and in that sense, it is artificial. And that is quite important for me in all my fiction.
Well, the novel is set in Victorian England, right? Victorian age is an age of contradictions. It's an age of Renaissance, the growth of liberalism, and at the same time, because of academic figures like Darwin, is also an age of racism, of extreme prejudices. You have on one hand, you have on the one hand things like John Locke, right, and all the thinkings and ideas of human rights and freedom, etc. On the other hand, you have people like Gaston, Darwin, who stress racial superiority as a new anthropological theory, with very few people who dared or knew how to challenge them. So, I mean, Victoria is a fascinating age, right?
And it's good you mentioned that, because in some ways, I mean, that's one of my attractions there, because the Victorian age does sometimes remind me of India today, which is also a land, and we are going through a period of huge contrasts. So in that sense, some similar problematics can be addressed.
Right. Any other questions? Yes. I mean, when we talk about Indian women, the most stories we keep reading from Financial Times or things is the wedding dowry paid by Indian fiancés or whatever. But after the lady asked,
I wanted to ask, how has growing up in Bihar affected your work?
Well, thank you for that question, because I kind of insist on being described as a Bihari writer from India based in Denmark at the moment. Sometime back, some Indian writers and critics described me as what Indians love to call NRI writers, which means non-resident Indian writers. And the West you would be called diasporic. And I said, no, I'm not diasporic, because these were all writers who had grown up in places like Bombay and Delhi, and then had been mostly educated abroad. And I said, no, I spent 24 years of my life in a small town of the sort that most of you would not be able to live in for more than 24 days. And then I spent 4 or 5 years working as a lowly staff reporter in Delhi, chasing around, covering the crime and politics, which is, of course, very often criminal anyway. So I don't want to be called diasporic. In that sense, I do feel that for me, it's important to be seen as coming from Bihar, which is a very specific part of India, rather than be seen as coming from India, because of course what is India? There are so many different kinds of India, and while I am Indian nationally, I have an Indian passport and all that, which makes me Indian. Culturally, I am a specific kind of Indian. So I embed some of those elements in my novels. Even this novel, which does not really take place in Bihar, has some very oblique references to Bihar. And those references have a lot to do with my background. Also, the narrator of this novel is actually based in Bihar. The novel is narrated by someone who discovers some papers in a library in a small town like the town I come from, and stitches the papers together to construct this narrative. And of course, this narrative then is about an Indian from, again, Bihar, who is taken to London by an Indian captain who wants to record his history of supposed criminality, and in the process, this Indian gets involved, starts being suspected of being involved in a series of murders that take place in London. Then a group of other immigrants from the same kind of working class get together to try and clear his name. That's what the novel is mostly about.
On page 3 of filming, you have about 2 or 3 pages without any punctuation. So I was just wondering, what's the reason behind that?
Okay. Now, this is the kind of thing an author should never say, but I'm going to say it. Okay. This novel came out a few years before. The Thing About Thugs. The Thing About Thugs has just come out in India and it's coming out in America and elsewhere next year, actually. So it hasn't really come out in the West yet. This has come out in England and India and other places. And I think it's about 6-7 years back. I must say that this is the novel that is closest to my heart in some ways. Okay. It also got rave reviews. in England and India and elsewhere, but it's also a novel that sold the least. This novel's been selling very well. And I can understand why, because this is a novel that is slightly more difficult to read. Okay, the only way you can read it is if you read all of it, and then at the end of it try and make sense of what you had read earlier. Okay, this you can read in a linear way, and it will keep on making sense. And in that sense, it's more like normal novels. And one of the things that sometimes readers have trouble with are these sections in this novel. These are very short sections, 1 page to 2 pages, that are written in English without any kind of punctuation. And these are sections that are given different titles, and the one that you referred to is, I think, called Rasa Terrible. And these are taken from the Rasa theory of classical Sanskrit aesthetics. And each Rasa depicts a state of mind, but it's a state of mind of a character whom you meet in the novel, in the other part, the properly punctuated parts of the novel. But these 2 or 3 lines are this character thinking about something, and certain images which are kind of half dreamt, half real for this character. And because all these images and all these ideas blur into each other, there's no punctuation in those sections because it's just happening in his mind. It's a bit like what in the past would be called a stream of consciousness.
You're using your pen like a camera lens, panning across, making it as visualized as possible. I mean, this technique is closer to what is called stream of consciousness. If you read stuff like some passages, like from The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, many modern writers have used that kind of technique. What's like Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, right? So, I mean, somehow this can be a bit difficult for readers to guess what the hell is happening. But sometimes literature is felt by your heart, right? So at least some passages could be felt by your heart, and some could be read by the mind. So this is where the magic is. I mean, it's a startling and shocking opening, right? So
and I would suggest when you read this section, just read on without pausing. Yeah. Don't try to punctuate it. Just read on, and just think of the image it leaves you, because it doesn't really matter. But when you move to the other sections, which of course much more, you get the story.
Because you are very, very much influenced by cinema, right? You like filming. I mean, the structure of this film, of this novel is like that of a film, right? So it requires a slightly different approach on the part of the mind of the readers, to appreciate a piece of stuff like that. So it's just like watching abstract paintings, Cubism by Picasso. When that came out at the turn of the last century, many people were mystified what it is about, why the woman's face could be cut into different pieces, right? So I mean, that's what you call modernism. It's got the influence. It had the influence across genres and different ways of creativity, ranging from paintings to music to literature.
And just one more matter, because this takes place largely in the 1940s, and that was also the period when that kind of a style was being used by writers who were writing in English and some other European languages. So, and I do bear these things in mind. For example, here the style is closer to what you will encounter in late Victorian fiction, very hefted, formulated sentences.
Well, you seem to have a bit of an obsession with the past, with the colonial past, right? 1940s, the Victorian age. There was when, India. I think, is that more or less how India is largely defined, right, in the West?
I think I haven't really been able to do that, and that's one of the reasons why I haven't written what would be called absolute bestsellers, and I have novels that get good reviews and some of them sell, but they don't sell like, say, the novel on which Slumdog Millionaire was based. And part of the reason is that I don't always cater to some of these standard expectations. So while I engage with the past, for example, I don't go to the hill stations in India. If you talk about a kind of British presence, it's a good idea to base your novel in the hill stations because that's a very British Raj nostalgia element. Or do some kind of multicultural London novel. And I did, this is actually my tongue-in-cheek version of this multicultural London novel, because all these multicultural London novels, some of them excellent novels by people like Zadie Smith, Monica Ali, take place in contemporary London. And so I decided to write a multicultural London novel that actually takes place in London in the 1830s, 40s. So in that sense, I'm interested in history, but I don't always select what would be easily marketable. This novel too, when I wrote this, I had a contract with the British publisher that published it, and they asked me, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I said, "Well, this is what I'm working on." And my editor said, "Oh, that's good. You're writing your Bollywood novel." And I said, "No." And I said, "Why not? It's about Bollywood." I said, "No, Bollywood is a term that came up in the 1970s. This is a novel that more or less ends in the 1940s. If you want to..." Then she said, "Oh, but can't we describe it as your Bollywood novel? Because everyone wants to read about Bollywood." I said, "No, you can describe it as my Bombay films industry novel, not my Bollywood novel." So, and they were so disappointed because, of course, Bollywood sells. Bombay film industry, who knows?
Well, that's what Edward Said called Orientalism, right? Yes. But I remember when I saw a film in the early 1960s. My parents took me there. It was a film now you can't find it on the DVD anymore, called Junction Bovenai, right? It was starred by Ava Gana and Stanley Stewart Granger, right? I mean, it was set in India shortly before independence. So all the Indian people, were just nothing more than a big blurred crowd of background, right? Creatures, right? Buzzing, with boisterous, with noise, but the focus, the limelight, the limelight is on the couple, the Caucasian couples, whose romance and who are struggling to escape from the country, and that sort of things, right? So have you lived in the UK?
Not for any extended period of time, no. I've visited the UK, but I never lived there.
How do you find that compared with Denmark? Because Denmark has never colonized any Asian or African countries.
No, Denmark did have a couple of colonies in the south of India, and Denmark was a colonial power once in the 17th, 18th century, but it colonized other parts of the country. Denmark's a very lucky country in the sense that Denmark's always managed to get rid of things at the right time. So there was a time when it was the leading slave trading country in Europe, but it got out of it before slave trading became unfashionable. There was a time when it was a major colonizing country, but it got out of it before being a colonizers became unfashionable. It lost territory to both Sweden and Germany, which means that Germany has a Danish minority, and Sweden had a Danish minority, but Denmark had no ethnic minority, which means that it's very easy for even well-meaning Danes to be patronizing with people like me and kind of say, well, we are not used to people like you, we are all... Well, as one of my Danish friends says, Denmark is the only tribe that became a nation-state. And there's an element of truth there. But now, before I sum up there, and England is very different there. I must say that England is much more mixed and much more aware, even internally. When we say England, of course, we mean Britain. If you say Britain, you know how many different nationalities and cultures are already involved, let alone, of course, the fact that the British have been very conscious of their colonial history, for better and for worse. But having said that, the novel I've just finished working on, and that will come out in India next year and in the West the year after. I always publish in India a year before I publish in the West because I want to be seen as an Indian writer based abroad and not vice versa. And that novel, I won't tell you the story, but that novel takes place in contemporary times. So I have stopped being historical in contemporary times, and it is called How to Fight Islamist Terrorism from the Missionary Position.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I used to have a Danish flatmate when I was in London, and now you're living in Denmark. Do you think that Denmark has got it right when it comes to multiculturalism. I mean, has any country got it right? Because you were saying that this, I try your cuisine, you try my cuisine, that doesn't work. So what works?
When I started off, when I moved to the West for the first time, I was skeptical of the discourse of multiculturalism that I sometimes heard. And now actually I end up defending the discourse of multiculturalism. And our position is simply pragmatic because too many politicians have come up and dismissed it without really understanding what that kind of dismissal also means. So while a certain kind of simplified multiculturalism, commodified multiculturalism is problematic, the fact that all cultures are multicultural is, of course, also essential. So, and what really works in this case is an honest desire to accept the fact that no culture has ever been pure. All cultures are influenced by each other. That while we can learn from each other, we'll also be challenged and frightened of each other because differences enable you to learn, but differences also frighten you. So an honest desire to accept the good and the bad as coming together, which is very different from this kind of multiculturalism, which means visiting an Indian restaurant or a Chinese restaurant and having a bit of cuisine there and feeling multicultural, because that's not really being multicultural, that's just being rich. Okay? And there's a difference between the two.
David?
Yeah, Tabish, I was very interested in the comment that you made when you began by saying that writing is something that, if you're going to become a writer, that's something that you have to feel that it's something you have to do rather than something you just want to do or, something to fill in the time. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the creative process. And, well, let's take the book about the thugs. I'm wondering whether you could just tell us how such a book comes to you. I mean, what are the kinds of ideas that come to you that make you feel that this is something you just have to write? And I'm wondering, for example, does this come, partly from your reading of history? You've talked about, being a wide reader of history, and of course that's very obvious in the thing about thugs. So did this come from your historical reading, or I guess it had a multiplicity of sources. But I wonder if you can tell us how you kind of, you've got something and you're bringing it together. I think there are probably people in this room who actually would be interested to hear about how a writer goes about that kind of thing.
It's an extremely vital question. It's also a very difficult question to answer, and I'll try and do my best. Before I start answering it, I must say that the 3 novels I've written before the one that I just mentioned, the one that I've almost finished writing, How to Fight Islamist Terrorism from the Missionary Position. The 3 novels I wrote before this one, the new manuscript, have been quite different. Because those 3 novels I started with, the way to understand it would be to think of the fact that I knew the size of the canvas. I knew what colors I wanted to put on that canvas. And I knew some of the figures that would appear. But I did not have a clear vision of the painting. Okay? As I started putting those colors on that canvas, as I started sketching those figures, some other colors, not major colors, but some other minor colors appeared, colors that I thought would not be there. Some other figures, some other lines appeared, lines that I thought would not be there. And some lines or some figures that I thought would be dominant became less dominant. So at the end of it, I still got the canvas I had in mind. I had the tone and some of the figures, but it was not exactly as I had imagined when I started off. Okay? The new manuscript, the one that I finished, with that manuscript, I had the entire story. I had all the characters. And I sat down and wrote it in 6 months. Now, all my other novels take me between 2 to 3 years to write. Have taken me between 2 to 3 years to write. This one took 6 months. Now, why? I don't know. I was a bit worried because I said 6 months, that's not enough. Perhaps because it's based in contemporary Denmark. perhaps because it's an idea I've been thinking about for the last 10 years, ever since I moved to Denmark. People kept on asking me, are you going to write a novel set in Denmark? I kept telling them, I don't know. I don't feel I can write about Denmark yet. But of course, I had been thinking about it. And then one fine morning, all of it just fell into place. So I think in my case, I can think of these two different kinds of creativity. But of course, again, the novel that I finished writing is not just based in contemporary Denmark. It's also more of a humorous, satirical novel. So perhaps there's also a difference of genre here, because the other three novels were different. But by and large, I would say that's how I begin. I have the canvas in mind, and that's very important. I more or less know how the novel is going to begin and how it's going to end, more or less. And I have the main figures in mind, I have the main tones in mind, the main issues and themes in mind. But a lot of other things can change as you work. It's not as if I end up with exactly what I had set out to create.
It's like parachuting. You take the leap and you leave yourself to the wind, right? And then hopefully you safely land on the ground.
Yeah, and don't break your legs.
Yeah. Occasionally you do, right? As long as you're in one piece, that's fine. Right? But you leave yourself to the wind, right? Okay?
So,
Yes?
what do you think about e-books? There's only one e-book that you can download more than 1,000 studies. So do you think as a writer, it may influence all the writers living? Electronic books.
The e-book. What do you think the e-book
It's
is
quite
going to
popular now.
It's a universal question I put forward to every writer.
I have a slight hearing impairment, which is why sometimes I have trouble following questions. Well, I don't have a slight hearing impairment, but anyway, that's what I like to call it. But I'm trying to educate myself, okay? I had a long route to Hong Kong. I had a flight from Aarhus, where I'm based, to Copenhagen to Helsinki. That got delayed, so I got rerouted to a flight to Bangkok, and from Bangkok to Hong Kong. And the last leg, the gentleman sitting next to me had a Kindle and was reading. And I'd never been sitting next to someone with a Kindle, that close to someone with a Kindle before. So I kept on kind of like taking a look at how it worked. But that's how ill-informed I am at the moment. I still like the feel of paper. I like being able to thumb back and forth. I like being able to look up 3 or 4 pages at the same time, which I cannot do at least on my computer. I don't know whether it's possible on Kindle, whether actually you can have different pages juxtaposed. So if you want to look at page 28 while you're reading page 140, you could have page 28 next to page 140, which you can in a book, because you can be reading here and you can go back and look at this page. Okay, and that worries me a bit. I sometimes wonder whether that kind of reading is not going to change the way we read altogether. Some of it will probably be for the better, some of it will probably be for the worse. But I do feel that, for example, younger people, I feel that they have a more breathy way of reading, as if they read things much faster. And sometimes I wonder whether that doesn't have to do with computer screens. For example, when you read a novel or read a book, your eyes follow the words in one direction, okay? But when you read on a computer, the cursor moves the words up too, okay? So you read much faster, or you can read much faster. Your eyes go this way and the text go that way. Okay? So it's very easy to read things very quickly on a computer screen. And I don't write the kind of literature, I feel I don't write the kind of literature that should be read too quickly. So there's one part of me that seems a bit worried. Is this a trend that's going to help writers like me? Or do I need to actually write different kinds of literature? Some ways the novel that I have just finished writing might have been influenced by that, also because it's based in contemporary times. For example, I've used shorter sentences. Now that's one of the things I can see happening. Some people just cannot write complex sentences anymore. They can only write simple sentences. And that might not be a bad thing, but for me it's a kind of pity because language has to have all these different registers. And for me, one of the things I like about Victorian literature is the way sentences can somehow suggest the movement of an idea. A sentence starts with another idea and it ends by actually complicating that idea altogether. Someone like Joseph Conrad does it all the time.
Well, you use some very short and laconic sentences, and at the same time, you use very long and convoluted sentences, just like skillful use of daggers and long swords. Right?
Thank you.
So, right, we're coming to the end of the session, and thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I think you have got much for us to learn. We all come from Oriental backgrounds, and thank you for your inspiration. Do come to Hong Kong again.
Thank you. It's been lovely.
Thank you, Dr. Khair and Mr. Chow, for the inspiring sharing.